I am pleased to be with you again. I am Larry McCormick, your Master of Ceremonies. It's my pleasure to do that for you this evening. This marks the 13th Annual Thurgood Marshall Lecture and Dinner, and I'm pleased to have been a part of this. I'm pleased to have been a part of this auspicious event for the last 3 years. The reason we gather each year is really twofold: to recognize the contributions of our keynote speaker, Professor Lani Guinier, and also to celebrate the work of the Center for African American Studies here at UCLA. Now in its 33rd year, the Center for African American Studies is entering into a new phase of continued excellence and increased scholarly activity. The Center fulfills its mission by promoting research and academic programs, maintaining a library, putting on special projects, and publishing current work in African American studies. It is one of the leading centers of its kind, not in California, not in the West, but in America. And I think they are to be commended for that. Leading the center in his first year as director is Professor Darnell Hunt. Professor Hunt received an AB in journalism from USC, that other school, an MBA from Georgetown, and a PhD in sociology from, voila, UCLA. As a sociologist, Professor Hunt's research is concentrated on images of blacks in the media, particularly in television, something about which I know a little. The author of several books, he is currently working on a study that examines data from the Screen Actors Guild 2000 African American Television Report, which was the result of 2 years of research into how blacks are used in primetime television. Professor Hunt's goal is to see CAAS become the primary source for information on the African American population in the West and to start an archive of Southwest African American history. It is my pleasure then to introduce to you the director of the Center for African American Studies, ladies and gentlemen, Professor Darnell Hunt. Darnell.
Thank you, Larry. It is my pleasure to welcome you all here this evening. However, before I go on, I think I should say a little bit about our Master of Ceremonies. He's multi-talented, multifaceted, well-respected. Larry McCormick currently serves as a veteran newsman and was recently honored for 30 years of service to Los Angeles television station KTLA. In his 44 years of broadcasting, including 33 years in television news, Larry has been nominated for several Emmy Awards. He's been the recipient of a number of Golden Mike Awards and the recipient of the prestigious Governor's Award. Larry has also been very active in the Los Angeles community, especially the LA Black community, where he is considered to be a leader of considerable significance. Today, Larry continues to bring integrity and vast news experience as co-anchor of KTLA's News at 10 Weekend Edition and weekday feature anchor for News at 10. He is also co-host of a highly lauded Making It, Minority Success Stories, seen every Sunday at 6:30. We are very pleased to have Larry McCormick join us yet again for this 3rd year this evening. Thank you, Larry. It is now my special pleasure to recognize our sponsors who helped make this evening possible. First of all, we have Northrop Grumman Corporation, University of California Office of the President, Winston C. Dobie, Universal Studios, AT&T, Nestle, UCLA Office of Student Affairs, a long list here, Renee L. Campbell, James Lincoln, Kaiser Permanente, Vice Chancellor Claudia Mitchell-Kernan, Denise Nicholas, Rita Rothman, Sempra Energy, Bobby Smith, Oscar L. Turner, UCLA Government and Community Relations, UCLA School of Law, and last but not least, W Hotels Westwood. Thank you all. Now I'd like to also recognize several special individuals in attendance this evening. First of all, I'd like to recognize the many current UCLA students who are in attendance this evening. For you are the lifeblood of the university. Next, I'd like to acknowledge David Tchaikovsky, Los Angeles Unified School Board member, Caprice Young, current Los Angeles Unified School Board president. And we also have representatives from U.S. Senator Dianne Feinstein's office, from Los Angeles City Attorney Rocky Delgadillo's office, and from Assemblyman Rod Wright's office, and finally, from the office of Los Angeles County Supervisor Yvonne Braithwaite Burke. We also have in attendance 12 of the 331 African American students who were recently admitted to UCLA's 2002 fall class, and their parents. Now, they haven't decided to join the UCLA family yet, but we're going to make sure that changes before the evening is over, all right? Now, there's a prominent figure who all of us here at UCLA recognize as a pivotal player in our long-standing efforts to open up this university to students of all backgrounds. He's been a fixture on the UCLA campus for 43 years, but recently left to assume the important role of Vice President of Educational Outreach for the UC system. That man, of course, is former UCLA Vice Chancellor for Student Affairs, Winston C. Dobie. Winston, could you please come to the front? Winston, on behalf of the center, I would like to present you with this plaque. It reads, Winston Dobie, PhD, thank you for your dedication and commitment to UCLA and the broader community. UCLA Center for African American Studies, February 28, 2002. It is now my pleasure to introduce UCLA's Vice Chancellor for Graduate Studies and Dean of the Graduate Division, Claudia Mitchell-Kernan. Dr. Mitchell-Kernan is widely known for her early work in the area of linguistic anthropology and for her classic studies in the late 1960s and 1970s on the speech patterns of black children. Her more recent research spans topics such as African American marriage patterns, children's discourse, and television and the socialization of minority children. Throughout her career, she has maintained an active record of service nationally to federal agencies that sponsor research. Indeed, President Clinton appointed her to the National Science Board for a 6-year term in 1994. And of course, she's remembered most fondly by many of us in this room as the 8th director of the center from 1976 to 1989, Claudia Mitchell-Kernan.
Good evening. On behalf of Chancellor Carnesale and the entire UCLA community, it's my very great pleasure to welcome you and to have the honor to make a few opening remarks on this evening of the Annual Thurgood Marshall Lecture on Law and Human Rights. Thurgood Marshall was a man of such great and well-deserved renown that we tend to think we know everything about him. I'm always surprised when some new information surfaces. Did you know, for example, that when he went to college, Marshall was planning to become a dentist? I think we should all be grateful that he figured out more useful ways to get on people's nerves. Recently, I learned some new things about his accomplishments in the arena of foreign affairs, achievements that are sometimes lost in the brilliance of his career as a civil rights attorney and U.S. Supreme Court Justice. Some of his roles in the international arena were rather ceremonial, but at least one role was of considerable substance and significance, contributing to Kenya's first constitution. In an interview at UC Berkeley, Julius G. Kiano, a leader of Kenya's government for 30 years, recalled that period in early 1960. When the British government agreed to sit down with Africans to work out a program for independence, the nature of the new constitution emerged as an important issue. Being very practical people, Kiano said, the Kenyans wrote to Justice Marshall, who was still in private practice at the time, and asked for his advice. In the role of a constitutional advisor, Justice Marshall went to Nairobi and later to London, where a constitutional conference was held. Given how many times he'd made use of the U.S. Bill of Rights, it's not surprising that Justice Marshall insisted on a Bill of Rights in the Kenya Constitution. In reaching out to Thurgood Marshall, the nation-building Kenyans made a linkage between the African and African-American struggles, the drive to be free of colonizing powers, and the drive to end racial oppression. Leaders on both sides of the Atlantic made this connection, from people like Du Bois, Padmore, and others, to Nkrumah and Kenyatta in Africa. Since African nations achieved statehood, Africans and African Americans have moved in somewhat different directions. Like family members, we are no longer as close as we once seemed to be. If African Americans have failed to challenge significant human rights issues in Africa, South Africa being an exception, Africans have found few occasions to raise questions about ongoing civil rights and economic injustices in the Americas. It's impossible to predict whether or under what circumstances these old friends will find common cause again. The globalized economy places Africans and African Americans in different situations. Political violence outside the context of nation states, wars between causes instead of countries, have become more and more pronounced. It is a confrontational era where those in conflict seem more likely to reach for weapons than for words. And yet the power of words is undeniable. I think of an anecdote about Justice Marshall's visit to Kenya, as recorded in a recent biography. According to this story, a restive crowd had gathered in Nairobi to hear Marshall when a colonial policeman challenged him. Marshall considered resistance and then remembered the anti-British pamphlets in his pocket. A confrontation that led to jail seemed counterproductive. Could he speak just one word to the crowd, he asked the policeman, who agreed. Marshall climbed on top of a car, gestured to the crowd for quiet, and shouted one word, Uhuru. You can imagine the response. And of course, in 1987, when UCLA's Center for African American Studies began its lecture series honoring Thurgood Marshall, it was his remarkable achievements as a lawyer and jurist that we honored. Then and now, he stood as a symbol of the great 20th century struggle to use the judicial system in the battle for civil rights, to turn the law that had oppressed a people into a mechanism for its liberation. If the tide of that effort now seems to have turned, it makes his achievements no less memorable. Brown versus the Board of Education remains a milestone in the civil rights struggle, even if we've learned since that time that segregation is not necessarily ended when laws supporting it are destroyed, nor does ending segregation necessarily mean that equality of opportunity will prevail. The struggle continues, and those who have contributed their strengths and talents have regularly appeared here to receive our honors. This year's speaker, Lani Guinier, shares with Justice Marshall a period of service to the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. We welcome her and we honor her efforts to find new pathways to continue the struggle for civil rights and for social justice. We thank her, we thank you for coming, and we hope you'll stay and enjoy the entire evening and enjoy your dinner. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, could we ask that you take your seats and rejoin your tables, please? We're ready to resume our program. And while we get ready to do that, you saw the young woman who was up here playing the saxophone with the John Davis Quartet a minute ago. First, let's have a great big round of applause for the John Davis Quartet. The young woman who was playing the saxophone so soulfully and so skillfully is a graduate of Washington Prep High School here in Los Angeles. She is a senior in music here at UCLA, and I am told she's already got 2 CDs out, but she can blow. Her name is Keisha Potter. Where are you, Keisha? Did she leave? Keisha, come on up here in front so everybody can see you while everybody's getting set down there. Keisha Potter. Here she is. She plays at a club in Long Beach. What club? Come on up here. I'm an old disc jockey, you know, I enjoy doing this kind of thing. Where do you, hi, how are you doing? Where do you play in Long Beach?
I play every Saturday night at the Cotton Club West. It's a part of Roscoe's Chicken and Waffles.
Okay, terrific. And I understand you're going to be working on your master's in music here at UCLA?
Yes, through the Afro-American Studies Department.
Through the African American Studies Department. She's going to be working on her master's. Good luck to you, Keisha.
Thank you.
Okay.
I'll be selling CDs and I have flyers.
Oh, she reminds me, she'll be selling CDs and she has flyers in the back. Music major with a minor in business. I don't want to get into trouble here by starting to introduce people because I know I'm going to overlook somebody, but I just have to acknowledge the presence of 2 of my good friends and 2 of the most beloved entertainers here in Los Angeles or anywhere in the world, Billy Davis Jr. and Marilyn Mccoo, right here. I had the great pleasure of playing their records both when they were the Fifth Dimension and then after that. Now I'm trying to play tennis. No, my legs are too bad for that. Lani Guinier, the first black woman tenured professor at Harvard Law School. She's the author of a 1998 personal and political memoir, Lift Every Voice, Turning a Civil Rights Setback into a New Vision of Social Justice. That's the title. Lani came to public attention back in 1993, as all of us well remember, when President Clinton nominated her to be the first black woman to head the Civil Rights Division of the U.S. Department of Justice, and then withdrew her name without a confirmation hearing. We can remember those days of agony. I know I certainly can. The experience prompted her to write this book, in which she uses the nomination debacle as a window on the civil rights movement, past, present, and future. A powerful work of scholarship and thought-provoking memoir, Lift Every Voice is a cry for a new commitment to civil rights and to social justice. The dean of the Yale Law School, Anthony Kronman, writes, in this stirring book, we hear Guinier's true voice. It is the voice of a Democrat searching for ways to widen and enliven our shrinking public life. It is also a moving personal testimony, a story of dignity and principle and hope from which every reader can take heart. Lani Guinier, whose views on democracy and voting rights were widely misinterpreted and vilified during her nomination as Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights, was denied an opportunity to speak for herself at the time. Her experience led her to use her public platform to speak out on issues of race and gender and democratic decision-making. She's written extensively in law review articles and published several books like The Tyranny of the Majority, 1994, Becoming Gentlemen, Women, Law Schools, and Institutional Change, 1995, and op-ed pieces about new ways of approaching old problems, including issues of affirmative action, the testocracy, she calls it. I liked it. Going to hear more about that, I'm sure, I have a feeling. The testocracy, gender equity, and race-conscious districting. Lani Guinier is a graduate of Radcliffe College and Yale University Law School. During the 1980s, she was the head of the voting rights program at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, where she litigated cases throughout the South. In 1998, she joined the faculty of the University of Pennsylvania Law School, and in 1998, she became a professor of law at Harvard, where she teaches courses on professional responsibility for public lawyers. There's something we could use a lot more teaching about law and the political process, and critical perspectives on race, gender, class, and social change. She's been recognized for her achievements with many, many awards, including the 1995 Champion of Democracy Award from the National Women's Political Caucus, the 1995 Margaret Brent Women Lawyers of Achievement Award from the ABA Commission on Women in the Profession, the 1994 Rosa Parks Award from the American Association of Affirmative Action, the 1999 Big Sisters Award, and the 1994 Harvey Levin Teaching Award, given to her by her students at the University of Pennsylvania Law School. Isn't it great when your students say, hey, you did something special, you're something special. She's presently working on a new book to be published by Harvard University Press titled The Miner's Canary, Enlisting Race, Resisting Power, Transforming Democracy. Ladies and gentlemen, Professor Lani Guinier.
Well, thank you all very much. The new book is, in fact, at least a month old. And I want to talk to you about the themes of that book because I feel that in many ways they are both a testimony to the legacy of Thurgood Marshall, but also an effort to move beyond some of the work of Thurgood Marshall in order to acknowledge, recognize, and address the challenges of the 21st century, which are, in fact, different than the challenges of the last century. And so, in many ways, I am a law professor who teaches law students that the answer is not to go to court. I am a law professor who teaches law students that lawyers should not be leaders. I am a law professor who teaches law students that we need to find ways to locate power in a winner-take-all society in the people that we represent and not in the roles that we have been taught to play. And so in that sense, it's somewhat ironic to be speaking here in your Thurgood Marshall dinner. And I want to try to both play on that irony and then see if there aren't ways in which to embrace that irony. So the metaphor of the miner's canary is one way to begin to take on those challenges. The miners used to take a canary into the mines to alert them when the atmosphere in the mines was too toxic for the miners, and the canary had a more fragile respiratory system which would give way, signaling that there was a problem with the atmosphere in the mines. And the argument in The Miner's Canary, which is a book co-authored with Gerald Torres, is that the experience of people of color, the experience of women, the experience of gays and lesbians, the experience of the disabled, the experience of those who have been left out, the experience of those who've been excluded, the experience of those who have been marginalized is often the experience of the canary. Unfortunately, the way in which our legal system has taught us to think about issues of race in particular, when we see problems that converge around the canary, we locate those problems in the canary, and we pathologize the canary, and then we try to fix the canary, and perhaps give the canary a little pint-sized gas mask so that it can withstand the toxic atmosphere in the mines. And what I would like to try to suggest is that we need to use race differently to see that problems are made visible because of the way in which they affect the canary first, but that we have to use race to begin to transform not just the canary, but the atmosphere in the mines to benefit all of us. And so this is an argument about rethinking race and also rethinking power. And in the process of rethinking race and power, in some ways it also means that we have to rethink the role of lawyers and the role of law. Because it is lawyers and law and judges who have been telling us one story about race, which is a story of colorblind methodology as well as vision. It is a story that race is only about individuals, not about groups. It is a story that race is about personal bigotry, personal prejudice. It is a story about race simply as skin color, and therefore we need to ignore race in order to get beyond race. And I want to argue that we need to understand race not just as stigma, but as an asset. We need to think about race not just as something that we have to overcome, but we need to embrace race as a diagnostic tool that can help us to begin to mobilize, to transform the way in which we distribute resources in this society and the way in which we think about power. So this is about rethinking race and rethinking power using the metaphor of the miner's canary. So that may sound very abstract, so I want to try and make it more concrete and tell you a story that is part of chapter 4 in the miner's canary, but it's also a true story. When I was offered the position at Harvard Law School, it took me several years to get up the, in some ways, the nerve to accept the position, because I was very worried that coming to Harvard would change me and make me become somebody that I no longer recognized. And I felt that I needed to be sure of who I was before I could go to some place where there was a possibility that I'd become something different. And in that process, I started to think very hard about issues of power and why it was that I was concerned that going to Harvard would change me. After all, I was an adult. I had been through a number of life-changing experiences, one might say. I thought I had survived, and yet there was a sense in which, because of the way that we construct power in this society, in which we think about power as zero-sum, that I win and you lose, and those who win get all the power, and obviously those who lose get nothing, and that when you are climbing up a hierarchy and you get to a place like Harvard, that it may be like climbing backwards up a cheese grater, right? Think about a cheese grater, right, as this pyramid. And as you are grating that cheese, and as the cheese is moving up that pyramid, right, it becomes smaller and smaller, a nubbin of what it once was. And you lose a sense of who you were and what originally motivated you to become a lawyer, to become a law professor. And so I didn't want to get to Harvard and become a nubbin of who I once was. So I was in the midst of thinking about all of these issues and decided, with the encouragement of my husband, who really wanted to leave Temple University, that we should go to Cambridge. So he and I were thinking about this. We informed our son, who was then 11, that we were moving from Philadelphia to Cambridge, and he was just horrified. After all, he had grown up in Philadelphia, he had known nothing else. And a group of his friends decided they would have a going-away party to give him encouragement that although he was leaving, he wouldn't be forgotten. They organized games to play at this party, and one of the games that they played was a golf ball relay race, where the object of the game was to carry a golf ball on a spoon without either touching the golf ball or dropping the golf ball, and you would carry the ball to one end of the yard and then pass it on to the next person on your team. And they organized the teams as the boys versus the girls. And they played this game twice, and both times the girls' team won. And the girls' team won apparently because they kept their eye on the ball, whereas the boys were very focused on the outcome and assumed that raw speed would get them first to the finish line. So they were racing across the yard and, of course, kept dropping the golf ball. Now, as the boys realized that they were losing, they engaged in various devious strategies to try to bend the rules. So they catapulted the ball toward the finish line, right? If they were going to drop the ball, at least drop it closer to the finish line. They palmed the cup of the spoon in their hand. They were told to hold the stem of the spoon, but they palmed the cup of the spoon. Didn't help. Both times the girls' team still won. So a group of us are sitting around. We are academics, most of us, and remember, I'm thinking about power and how is the move to Harvard going to change me, and what is the whole phenomenon of moving upward this cheese grater. And we start, as academics, to deconstruct the game. And we start talking about the gender dynamics that must be at play here, and why the girls had fine motor skills and the boys had gross motor skills, and that girls were more relational and they are weaker in a zero-sum society, and that girls don't cheat, right? But they follow the rules and cooperate with authority. And we're going on and on with this theorizing. And my mother, who is a former high school English teacher, was there, and she interrupted to ask a very simple question. Who designed the game? The girls did. The girls were the official hosts of the party, and the girls had been clever enough to call this a relay race, to play to the boys' assumption that if it was a physical game, that they would probably do very well. Meanwhile, my husband asks the girls to pose for a picture as the winners, and miraculously, it seemed that the girls became boys, right? And they posed, right, as female bodybuilders. So the girls have now won 2 rounds of this relay race. They have posed for pictures, and now they feel empowered as the winners to determine the next set of games that the children will play. And they don't even bother to include the boys in this next round. My son comes to me, he's very upset. He thought he was the guest of honor, and they're playing games and not including him. And so he's 11 years old. I say, well, why don't you go and play with the boys? And he said, well, because the girls are in the majority, and the girls have the power. And there was something about the dynamics that he was able to see the girls taking their winning of the game and converting it into a sense of license that they could now run everything. And he was acquiescing reluctantly, but on the other hand, he didn't have a strategy of resistance other than to come to his mother. Now, I tell you this story because it embodies the 3 dimensions of power that I think we need to really interrogate at the same time that we are rethinking race, at the same time that we are trying to move from a notion of race simply as stigma, simply as personal bigotry, simply as an issue of skin color, to a much more sophisticated idea of race as a lens on larger questions of injustice. And the reason we need to rethink power, in my view, is because race maps onto power, and race helps us see the ways in which power operates. So the first dimension of conventional power, and again, I'm talking about winner-take-all power, I'm talking about power in which I win, you lose, is the visible conflict. First dimension is what you can see in a competition. So you look at the relay race, you see the children compete, you see the girls win. But that's just the first dimension. And my mom's question really moves us to the second dimension, which is who designed the game? Who constructed the rules? And many times, whoever designs the game invariably predicts the outcome of the visible conflict. So you think that the conflict is happening in the relay race when the stage has been set by the rules. But it's the third dimension of conventional power that I really want to work with tonight, and that is the story that the winners tell the losers to convince both the winners and the losers that they each deserve their lot in life. Academics will call this the meta-narrative, the story behind all stories, the background narrative. And it is the story that we tell both about race and about power that make the losers feel it is futile to resist and give the winners this inflated sense that they deserve their winnings. And I want to challenge that story. I want to challenge the story of race. I want to challenge the story of power, because I feel that the way in which the law has constructed both race and power is basically a story of the status quo. And it is a story that tells us that whoever presently has power deserves it, and whoever doesn't have power is a loser, is someone who has been excluded because of flaws within their own personality, within their own culture, within their own interpersonal relationships. And that, again, is the pathologizing of the canary. That the canary may be showcasing all of these problems, but we are going to tell a story in which we locate the problems not in the toxicity in the minds, but in the canary. And we need to change that story so that we begin to use the canary as a lens on the larger problem, not as an embodiment of that problem. So let me give you a couple of examples in which I think that this metaphor, that this move from the margin to the center, from the experience of people of color to a bigger understanding of what's happening in the atmosphere and the minds, has actually occurred, and where As a result of that move, people have learned how to share power in a way that those who win don't have all the power and those who lose have nothing. So the first story is about Uri Treisman, who is a professor of calculus. He's now at the University of Texas. He was at the University of California, Berkeley. And he noticed that when he was at the University of California, Berkeley, that his first-year calculus students were not doing as well, the African-American students, as the first-year Chinese-American students. And he was curious as to why this was happening, and he talked to his colleagues, and his colleagues came up with the predictable responses, pathologizing the canary. The reason the African-American students were not doing as well in calculus is that they came from single-parent families, they had gone to high schools that hadn't prepared them as well, and most importantly, they had not studied. They were not as dedicated as the Chinese-American students. They were not spending as much time studying calculus alone in their dorm room. They were studying calculus by talking one to the other. They were talking calculus on their way to the study hall. They were talking calculus in their dorm rooms. They were talking calculus over breakfast, over lunch, over dinner. And it turned out that the process of intellectual engagement with your peers was a much more effective way of learning the critical skill, which was not memorizing formulas or trying to absorb things that were written on a page. The critical skill was learning to ask questions when you don't know the answer. The critical skill was having the self-confidence that you could admit you did not know the answer. And in the process of talking to others, realize they did not know the answer either. And that by putting your heads together, you could collaborate. And it was that intellectual engagement that enabled them to tackle the challenges of calculus. So Uri Treisman decided that he would conduct peer workshops, invited the African-American students to participate, served food, had seen the Chinese-American students studying calculus over lunch, seemed to create an informal atmosphere, and gave the African-American students calculus problems to work on together, encouraged them to ask questions, and then invited students who had recently done well in calculus to come to be able to answer some of the questions. Within the first semester of this peer workshop, the African-American students' calculus scores went up, and by the end of the second semester, the African-American students were among the highest scoring students in the class. He fixed the canary. But at that moment, he had an epiphany. He realized that it was not a problem of the African-American students, it was a problem of the way he, Uri Treisman, the sage on the stage, was teaching calculus to all of his students. He was standing up using what they call the chalk and talk method, right? He would stand and write on the blackboard, and then the students would busily write in their notebooks. And there was no interaction between him and the students, and there was no interaction among the students with each other. And he therefore introduced the idea of group-based problem solving into his calculus class for everybody. And it was that move of his willingness to share power, to share his authority with the students, that invited all of the students to participate differently in the process of learning calculus. He took what seemed to be a problem that was located in the canary and realized it was a problem that was simply made visible by the fact that it converged around, collected around, was associated with a group that was visible. But it was not their problem. It was a problem with the atmosphere in the minds. So he took race and did not ignore it, but he also took race as a lens on a larger set of issues that involved a willingness to rethink power. And rethinking power is essential if we are going to begin to build coalitions that allow us to move forward without relying on lawyers to file legal briefs, but by beginning to understand that in many ways, whereas the problem for Thurgood Marshall was a legal challenge to formal Jim Crow, the problem in the 21st century is a political challenge to the meta-narrative, to the story behind all stories. And it is a problem that we cannot rely only on courts to respond to. We have to begin to tell a different story about race and power. A group of women challenged the height requirement for the New York City Police Department a number of years ago on the grounds that it was discriminatory because the height requirement for New York City police officers was about 5 feet 10 inches tall, and many of these women were not 5 feet 10 inches tall. Now, the height requirement was the rule. The height requirement was that second dimension of power. But the height requirement was a rule that was designed to tell a certain story about what kind of activity we expect police officers to engage in. They wanted police officers to be big because they expected that police officers would be dominating criminals, that the role of the police was to identify a crime as it was taking place and then intervene to control the conflict. And in order to do that, you had to be big. And so the rule was also related to the story. When they challenged the rule, women became police officers, so did short Asian men, so did short Latino men, so did short white men. But it also meant that these women who were not 5 feet 10 inches tall also had to begin to challenge the story of what it took to be a good police officer. And one of the most important messages of the events in Los Angeles 10 years ago, after the beating of Rodney King and after the first jury acquittal of the officers who had been engaged in that beating, the city of Los Angeles convened a commission to study police brutality. And one of the findings of that commission was that if the city of Los Angeles wanted to do something about police brutality, they needed to hire more women. And they needed to hire more women, not because the women were reluctant to use their weapons, but because many of these women, when seeing a conflict situation, were inclined to dissipate the conflict, not to try to dominate it. And indeed, in New York City, after they prevailed with a consent decree that opened up the department, a group of Black and Puerto Rican women were assigned to patrol a housing development and were invited to live in that housing project and became part of that community. And in the process, they became aware in advance of who the likely troublemakers were. They were able to identify many of the young men who were involved in misbehavior that had gotten them into trouble in the past. And these Black and Puerto Rican women mentored those young men. They reached out to them and showed them respect. And grateful for the attention of an adult, many, not all, but many of those young men constrained their own behavior. And the incidences of violent crime in those housing projects patrolled by Black and Puerto Rican women went down. Again, this is a miner's canary, because what seemed to be a problem that was located in the canary, these short women who weren't big and strong and couldn't become police officers, was actually evidence of a view of policing that was not the most functional way of keeping the peace, especially in a multiracial society. Again, these women were not exercising power in a way that meant I win, you lose. They were exercising power in a much more collaborative and community-oriented way, that they were identifying these potential troublemakers as members of the community who should be encouraged to remain members of the community, not as people that we should wait for them to do something wrong so that we can dominate them and haul them off to jail. Now, the really hard issue that I want to talk about using this idea of the miner's canary is the issue of affirmative action. And it is the issue of access to higher education, and it is the issue that is obviously of great interest at the University of California, Los Angeles. And again, I think that many things that appear to converge around the canary are actually signals of problems with the way in which access to higher education is being distributed, not only in California, but throughout the United States, using a test-centered approach that, in fact, I call the testocracy. And this testocracy is based on a story, right? A story that says, if you are good at timed paper and pencil tests, that somehow you have merit. If you are good at timed paper and pencil tests, that you have merit, that we should reward by making it possible for you to attend the flagship schools, the premier schools of the University of California system of higher education. Now, why do we rely on your ability to do well on timed paper and pencil tests? What is it that those tests actually tell us about you? Well, one argument is that they tell us that you are a quick, strategic guesser with less than perfect information. Girls, for example, routinely do less well on the math portion of the SAT. They also don't do as well on the LSAT. And yet, when they get to college, their math grades are the same as some of the boys. In fact, sometimes they do better. And many people assume that the reason girls don't do as well on the math portion of the SAT is because they're being ignored in high school math classes, or they're not taking math classes to the same extent as the boys. And I'm sure there's some merit, some value, some basis for that claim. But if you ask girls and boys how they approach the test, it gets back to some of what Uri Treisman was learning in his study of the calculus students. The boys approach the test like a pinball machine, right? And they race through it, and remember, quick strategic guessing with less than perfect information, well, that's a very good strategy for getting through a timed test, which values speed. And what do the girls do? They try to work through a problem before they put down the answer. Terrible strategy on a timed test. And yet part of the reason that the girls are working through the problem before they put down the answer has to do with self-confidence. So that's where the girls' treatment in math classes may in fact be relevant. And this leads to some of the work of Claude Steele and his work on stereotype threat, and the fact that when he gives, and this is in a psychology lab, he's a professor, chairman of the psychology department at Stanford, when he gives experimental tests to black and white college students and graduate students, all of whom are high achievers, very invested in their ability to achieve, if he tells the black students, this is a test that is a necessary precondition before we get on to the meat of the experiment, the black students do just as well as the white students. But if he tells the black students, this is a test of your intellectual ability, the black students' scores plummet compared to the white students. And part of his theory as to why this happens is that the black students, worried about expectations regarding their intellectual capacity, go back over their questions and begin to second guess their first answers. And they spend a lot of time working through the problem before they put down the answer. And when you're talking about aptitude tests, it is about speed, not carefulness. Now, it's not just that black students respond this way. When he gives this prompt to white males who do very well in math, and he says to them, this is a test of how well white males do in math compared to Asian males, the white male scores go down. So part of this, again, goes back to the notion of self-confidence and the ability to know how to take a test, the knowledge of the rules of the game, that second dimension, but also the story that is being told about that test, the story that tells some people they are going to do well on the test and tells other people that they need to go and work through the problem before they put down the answer. Now, if these tests truly predicted excellence, then I would have to change my argument. The problem is these tests barely predict first-year college grades. Now, why do I say barely? You know, statisticians will be horrified at what I'm saying here because they're very proud that there is a modest relationship between the SAT and first-year college grades. They're very proud that there is a relationship between first-year college grades and scores on the SAT. But it is a relationship when you do all of the regressions that basically says if you know someone's SAT, 15% of the time you can predict the variance in first-year college grades. Okay? 15% of the time, right? That means 85% of the time you cannot predict the variance in first-year college grades. Now, you don't have to be a statistician to know 85 is a bigger number than 15. But it also comes back to the story that we're willing to tell. I was a voting rights lawyer. I worked for the NAACP Legal Defense Fund challenging voting laws in the Deep South, in Arkansas, in Alabama, in Mississippi, in Georgia. And we would go in and we would bring in statisticians and political scientists, and they would do these very complicated regressions trying to prove that various voting rules were unfair because of racial block voting, because of the fact that the majority in a particular community was of one race and that group refused to vote for candidates associated with the other race. And so in order to prove that there was racially polarized voting, we would bring in these experts who would be able to testify if you know someone's race, you can predict the race of the candidate that they are going to vote for at a certain rate. And so, for example, in Phillips County, Arkansas, we brought in a political scientist who went and looked at all of the elections in that community and all of the precinct data, and he basically said, if you know someone's race, you can predict the candidate they are going to vote for 90% of the time. Okay? And the judge looked at us and said, well, where's the other 10%? 90% just was not enough to demonstrate a relationship. And yet here we have an SAT in which 15% of the time there's a relationship, and somehow we have now decided that the story we're going to tell about the SAT is that this is the epitome of merit. Now you might say, well, it's really important to know who's going to do well first year in college. It's really important to know who's going to do well first year in law school. If that's true, then why is law school 3 years? Why is college 4 years? If all we're worried about is how well you do first year, then have college for a year. But there's an even stronger argument in this direction, and then there's another argument in a related but opposite direction. And that is, are we just worried about how well people do in college? Is that why we want people to go to college? Because we want them to do well while they're in college? That we are going to use the taxpayers' money to subsidize the education of students so that they can do well in college, without worrying about what they do once they graduate? is the mission of the University of California, Los Angeles, the mission of the University of California, Berkeley, the mission of the entire UC system to simply give opportunity for students to do well while they're in college? Or is there a larger public mission associated in a democracy with the notion of giving people the opportunity not only to do well in college, but to do well in life? And not only to do well in life for themselves, but to contribute to the community. Because after all, it is the community that is making their education possible. And these are people who are being given an opportunity not only to do well, but to make contacts that will enable them to become leaders in their community. And yet, if you look at the data showing who becomes a leader in his or her community after they graduate, it is not based on test scores. Harvard did a study, for example, of 3 classes of its graduates over a 30-year period. Now, Harvard was trying to figure out what predicted success as Harvard might measure it. And, of course, for Harvard, it was how much money do you make? How much fun do you have making the money? And do you give any of it back to Harvard? Now, they called it financial satisfaction, career satisfaction, and contribution to the community. 2 things related to success as Harvard defined it: low SAT scores and a blue-collar background. Low SAT scores and a blue-collar background. Those people who were motivated to take advantage of the opportunity to come to Harvard were those people who were most likely to succeed. University of Michigan Law School, another public institution, did a similar study of its graduates over 30 years and found that there was no relationship between high LSATs and other entry-level credentials and financial satisfaction, right? Everybody who graduated from the University of Michigan Law School did well financially. There was a modest relationship between high entry-level credentials, high LSATs, and career dissatisfaction, right? A modest relationship. That is, it was statistically significant only for those who graduated between 1980 and 1989. For the rest of the population, it was there but not statistically significant. That is, those with the highest entry-level credentials were more likely to be dissatisfied with their careers. But the strongest relationship was between high LSAT scores and a failure to become a leader in the community. That is, there was a negative relationship between high LSAT scores and leadership in the community. And they define leadership as mentoring younger attorneys, serving on community boards, doing pro bono work, right? This was not asking you to self-sacrifice your entire career in order to give to your community. The group that was the most likely to contribute to the community, to become leaders, to satisfy the mission of graduating students who were financially well off, enjoyed their career, and became community leaders were the students admitted under affirmative action. The Black and Latino students were the most likely to fulfill the mission of the University of Michigan Law School. And yet the story we tell is that the Black students and the Latino students are somehow less qualified to be there, even as they are performing at a higher rate to fulfill the mission of the institution. So that's going in one direction, which says, what does it mean to have merit? And why is it that the story we tell about who should be attending these schools is a story that valorizes performance on these timed paper and pencil tests? And part of the answer, I believe, is that those tests not only correlate with race, they correlate with class. And within each race and ethnic group, as your parental income goes up, so do your test scores. And although the relationship is modest between first-year college grades and your SAT scores, the relationship is much stronger between your SAT scores and your parental income. In fact, the relationship between SAT scores and first-year grades is weaker than the relationship between SAT scores and your grandparents' socioeconomic status. So that we have created a story in which we have a rule that says those people who are already affluent are somehow smarter. Those people who are already privileged are somehow the most deserving of a state-subsidized education. Those people who are affluent, who do well on these tests and don't contribute back to the community, are nevertheless the more meritorious applicants to a state-subsidized institution. Now, to me, this is an opportunity to rethink race and power. To rethink race because we have to move beyond affirmative action. And the reason I say we have to move beyond affirmative action is that it is not enough to consider exemptions from that, quote, meritocracy or that testocracy. It is not enough to say, well, everyone else can take the test, but we're going to have a group of people of color that don't have to take the test. Why aren't we saying no one should be taking this test and admitted solely or primarily based on this test, given the data that we have in front of us? We should be taking the experience of people of color and confirming that experience and extending it to the way in which we think about admissions for everyone. Rather than fighting over who gets in on the margin, we need to be fighting over who gets in at the settled core of these institutions. We need to be challenging that meta-narrative that performance on a timed paper and pencil test is somehow the symbol of excellence. Now, a group of Black and Latino law professors, college professors, legislators, activists, lawyers got together in Texas and did just that. They were confronted not with Proposition 209, but with a Fifth Circuit decision that abolished affirmative action in the University of Texas system. And they discovered that the University of Texas was using the SAT primarily as the means of admitting students to the college. And they discovered that there were 1,500 high schools throughout the state. And they discovered that using the SAT, 150 of those 1,500 high schools were dominating the freshman class at both of the flagship schools, UT Austin and Texas A&M. 10% of the high schools in the entire state were providing 75% of the freshman class at the University of Texas, Austin. And of course, those 10% of the high schools were coming from the suburbs of Austin, the suburbs of Houston, the suburbs of Dallas, as well as the independent schools. They put together a bill because they found out that actually grades in high school are a better predictor of college success, no matter where you go to high school. They put together a bill that said anyone in the top 10% of their high school graduating class is automatically eligible to be admitted to either of the two flagship schools, not to any school in the Texas system, but to the two flagship schools. And they got that bill passed, the Texas legislature, and Governor George Bush signed it. It was passed by one vote. And that one vote came from a Republican legislator from rural West Texas, because they were able to show him that not a single one of his constituents had been admitted to the University of Texas at Austin for the past 15 years, because the SAT was denying admission to working class and poor whites, not just to blacks and Latinos. So that by following the Canary and identifying what was happening to the Canary as a signal that there was a problem with the way these schools were admitting everyone, they were able to change the understanding of who deserved to be at these flagship schools. And at Texas, University of Texas, Austin, most of the leaders in the state have graduated from either Texas A&M or UT Austin. It is not just a place to get an education. It is a place to network to become a leader, whether it is a political leader, a business leader, or a community leader. And it is essential that when we think about education in a democracy, that we think about providing access in a way that everyone can share in that opportunity. So again, this is a move from the margin to the center. This is a move that looks at race, but also looks at power and challenges the way in which we are thinking about race, but also challenges the way in which we're thinking about power. And it says in terms of power, we are not just going to reserve access to the flagship schools to those who are already privileged. We are going to share that opportunity more broadly because, after all, this is a democracy. And if we can track the experience of the Canary, not only can we begin to rethink how to allocate scarce resources, we can also begin to question why those resources are so scarce in the first place. And if we were telling this story about the Canary, if we were telling this story in 1996, I think that it might have had a very different outcome in terms of 209. Because the argument that was being made in 1996 is that somehow blacks and Latinos were dominating access to higher education and working class and poor whites were suffering. In fact, it was true that working class and poor whites were not gaining access to these institutions, but it was not because of blacks and Latinos. For every one black who was at a four-year state college in the University of California system, 5 were in prison. For every one Latino male who was at a four-year state institution of higher education, 3 were in prison. And in fact, it was a shift in resources from education to prison that was creating this scarcity in the first place. In 1984, for example, California spent 2.5 times more on institutions of higher education than it did on prison. 1984. By 1995, the year before Proposition 209 was on the ballot, California was spending the same amount on prison as on institutions of higher education. And starting in 1995, California started spending more on prisons than on institutions of higher education. California cut 8,000 positions in the state university system and added 25,000 positions in the state penal system. California was paying a first-year college professor $41,000 a year and a prison guard $51,000 a year. Now, this shift in resources was not discussed because our conventional view of race said the only explanation for what's happening is that blacks and Latinos are hoarding these opportunities. But if we begin to think about the experience of race as the canary, we can begin to track the experience of blacks and Latinos. Again, the experience of blacks and Latinos who are not being tracked to college but are being tracked to prison, and see the way in which that will enable us to understand that there has been a dramatic shift in resources to fund prisons and not schools, and that shift in resources is affecting everybody. So it's not just enough to change the way in which we admit students to a scarce public institution. It is also important that we begin to make opportunities for everyone to go to college. And the only way we can do that is to begin to rethink race and rethink power. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Students, staff, and faculty of the Center for African American Studies would like to present you with this award. And I'm going to read it for you. It says, the UCLA Center for African American Studies proudly presents this award to Professor Lani Guinier for her commitment to the struggle for civil rights and for delivering the keynote address at the 13th Annual Thurgood Marshall Lecture on Law and Human Rights. So.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Lani, if you would stay here for just a moment.
Okay.
And also, as you may know, Lani, for only the second time in the history of the state of California, we have an African-American Speaker of the Assembly, and he is Mr. Herb Wesson, and a representative of his, Akili, has a special presentation to make to you at this time. Akili?
I should also tell you that UCLA is in our district, so we have a double responsibility.
Yes, you do.
On behalf of the Speaker of the State of California, Herb Wesson, we want to give you this certificate of recognition for your courage, for your commitment to civil rights, and for your commitment to democratic decision-making, and for your intellect. Was that not the greatest, simplest, direct speech you've ever heard? So we want to thank you. We want to welcome you to our district and always ask you to come back. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Akili. Again, ladies and gentlemen, Professor Lani Guinier. You know, the 3 years that I've been privileged to be the Master of Ceremonies for this event, you've set the bar pretty high, CAAS. My first year was Julian Bond. Last year it was Harry Belafonte. And Lani Guinier has certainly raised the bar, if anything, with her speech tonight. I'm starting to look forward to the phone call saying, will you come this year? I'm going to wonder who's going to be there this year. We'd like to take just a moment, and I know it's running a little late, to acknowledge the CAAS board members who are with us tonight. Would you all just stand in place wherever you are? We want to acknowledge your presence. All the board members. And say thank you very, very much. Now, on behalf of the Center for African American Studies, I'd like to thank all of you for joining us here this evening. And we hope to see you again next year. Have a good night. Be careful out there.